plan for tonight. So the plan for this evening is that the presentation will sort of have two parts. In the first one, we're going to do this big, long view of sort of the history of sexual abuse in the church in the patristic and medieval eras, just to give us a sense of the weight of culture that is behind this issue. And then, like good Anglo-Catholics, we're just going to skip from the medieval period right to the Victorian era to zoom in on a very specific reformer named J. Ellice Hopkins. So before we start though with sort of my bit of it, I just think that it's important to recognize that this is such a live issue for people. And we come to this story in many different ways. My own bit of a story is that, my wife was an oblate, a lay member with the monastic order that was founded after Vatican II in the Roman Church. And that founder turned out to be a serial abuser. And the way that the monastic order hid it and sort of kept it quiet and kept it from people was very disturbing. So that was sort of my personal entrance into this issue. I didn't know if other people maybe wanted to give us a sense of a temperature check for themselves and maybe how the crisis of the last few years has changed the way you think about church or about your own spiritual lives. We can return to that later too. Doesn't have to be something we share on Zoom. It can be very vulnerable.
Christopher, I do know that all employees of a parish have to take a couple of classes in preventing this sort of thing.
Right.
I did this years ago and thought it was very well done.
Right. Well, and just that, I think that is a testament. I think we're going to see how different of an approach that is than what the church has sort of historically done, this very open conversation about the reality of it and sort of expecting that this is an issue we're going to run into. So yeah, that's really helpful, Edie. So with all this in mind, I guess we can share screen here. And we can sort of begin our journey. So here we see the one picture we have of Hopkins, or at least the one that is online. I'm sure there's probably more in an archive somewhere. But we're going to go first into this brief history of abuse in the church. And, I think one of the common reactions we hear when a case opens or when it breaks, we hear what Francisco Carrillo said when it affected his parish. We never thought things like this happened. And in a way, that's a completely understandable perspective, right? There was an enormous amount of cultural trust put in the clergy. In the 70s, there are stories of parents saying, of course, you can go on a camping trip with the priest of the parish, just you and the priest. Like there was just a level of cultural trust in clergy that especially people in my generation can struggle to understand. And so when Francisco Carrillo says, we never thought things like this can happen, that's what he's getting at. But that statement also indicates in a way that the church is not in touch with the voices of survivors and victims, because it has happened. And so if we listen to them, that's one way of knowing things like this do happen. And then also it means that we've sort of become disconnected from our own Christian past. This isn't a new issue. It didn't just start happening in the 50s or whatever. This is a very long-term battle. We don't know. It's hard to know the prevalence of abuse in the ancient world or in the medieval period. We can't do statistical studies of those things. But we know right now, across cultures in different parts of the world, across different religions, the prevalence of abuse is high. The classic statistic for people in America is that 1 in 4 women will experience a form of sexual abuse. And there are some studies that show as high as 1/3. And then for men, it can be 1/5. There has been an international study of it being much higher than that for men even. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to know our past better. And that way we can know the voices of victims and survivors much better. And so one of the earliest references we actually have to sexual abuse in the church comes to us from Cyprian of Carthage. And he reports, well, he sort of criticizes a deacon who is living with 2 consecrated virgins. And this to him is very unseemly. And the women are actually excommunicated from the church. And then in order to rejoin the communion of the church, they actually have to submit to gynecological examination. This was the term that Cyprian set for them to be readmitted to communion. And so this is what I'm saying. It's a very deep issue. And a lot of my research, or a lot of what I'm presenting tonight, relies on the research of a woman named Diane Elliott. So I'll just flag that right now, and I'll have her book cover a little later. But Diane Elliott argues that there's a constellation of biblical verses that become very important for how the church begins to formulate approaches to sexual abuse. And one of these is, but take heed, lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. Now, this is from the Epistle of St. Paul to the Romans. He's talking about about eating food offered to idols. He says, this isn't a sin. We can eat this food. And yet we know that sometimes when we do something that's not necessarily sinful, it can cause someone else to be scandalized by our behavior and have them fall into sin. And so this idea of scandal and its ability to cause other people to fall into sin becomes sort of more and more an issue. Diana Elliott also points to these verses. And whosoever shall offend one of these little ones that believe in me, it is better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck. So again, you see that Greek word scandalize is in there. And then last we have, then said he unto the disciples, it is impossible but that offenses, scandala, will come, but woe unto him through whom they come. So just a quick poll. When I say the word scandal, like unmute yourselves and tell me what comes to mind with that word. What comes to mind when I say scandal?
Sex.
Okay.
Lawlessness.
Oh, what did you say? I'm sorry.
Lawlessness.
Lawlessness. Yes. And so, I think for us, we think of a scandal as something hidden that then becomes, oh, and now we know about it. That's sort of our notion of scandal. But in this patristic era, they have a different notion of what scandal means. And into the early and high Middle Ages. We see this in a figure like Rabanus Maurus, who's the Archbishop of Mainz. And by the way, I'm terrible at pronouncing things, so please feel free to criticize me and correct me. But it's this sense that it causes scandal when we cause other people to sin. And so when there are public figures who do publicly bad things, they should be punished publicly. But when people do things in secret, we should keep it secret to prevent scandal. So this is a quote. He says, it seems to me that priests caught publicly in perjury, theft, fornication, or other crimes of that sort should, according to the canons, fall from their rank, because this would create a scandal. For if they were not punished, it would cause a scandal. But those whose crimes are hid can acknowledge them through secret confession with a priest present to assign penance, through fasts, vigils, alms, and sacred prayers. So in other words, if you have a priest, infamous, sexually abusing people, fornicating publicly, well, must be publicly punished. If it's secret, keep it secret. And this is this is the impulse to cover up, in a sense, right? And it just becomes more and more knotted into the church as the years go by, especially during the Fourth Lateran Council and afterwards. That council was in 1215. And it was a council, as some of you might remember, that said all lay people need to go to confession with their parish priest once a year. And so this becomes a big question for priests. Like, how do we confess all these people? There are lots of manuals written, and there's a lot of fear on the part of the priests that this space of the confessional will become a space of temptation. And remember, there are no boxes. You don't go into a little closet to confess in this period. That's a counter-Reformation thing. You're sort of sometimes just doing it in the nave of the church. So there are manuals that talk about how priests should never look at the person who is confessing, that they should lie face down in a cruciform shape with their face to the ground in order to avoid any temptation stirring up by being excited by what someone is telling them or something like this. And so they begin to ask all these hypothetical questions. And one of the people asking these hypothetical questions is Henry of Ghent. He was a French scholastic at the University of Paris, lived from 1217 to 1279. And he came up with these sort of hypotheticals in collections called quodlibets, which means like as you please. And they're sort of just like a genre that scholastics would sometimes write in. And so one of his hypotheticals goes something like this. I sort of paraphrased these for us. He says, if you know that a brother is sinning, admonish him. That makes a lot of sense to us. That's the first thing we're told to do in the Gospels, after all. But if the brother is indifferent to the warning, you are not necessarily empowered to go to the superior. You have to ask, if I tell a superior, will the superior's admonition backfire and cause the brother to sin more? So there's this fear that if I get more people involved, it'll cause embarrassment to him, he'll be hardened in his sin, and it will have the opposite effect. I won't cure my brother, I'll just cause him to dig in deeper to his sin. So Henry of Ghent says, usually it's better to just shut up. I mean, obviously he said that in Latin, probably much more elaborately than I'm saying that. But that was one of the takeaways. He has another one that is particularly frightening. This is a question of what happens if a priest has begun to sort of sexually exploit. They wouldn't have used that word. They probably would have said fornicated or something like this. If a woman is sexually abused by her confessor, what does she do? Well, Henry says she cannot simply leave to seek another confessor. Remember, they're very worried about the parish priest being responsible for all the souls in his parish. And so there's this attempt to keep people inside those parishes. Henry, for instance, hated all the mendicant orders that were coming and offering confession. He thought this detracted from the purpose of the Fourth Lateran Council. The parish priest should be the confessor. So even if your confessor is sexually abusing you, you cannot simply leave to seek another. She actually has to ask her abuser for permission to leave. Now, if he refuses, she can act unilaterally. She can just go of her own will and go seek another confessor on her own. But Henry says she is not permitted to share any information about her previous confessor that would cause scandal. Again, this sort of silence is demanded. So you can actually imagine how this would go, where a woman would ask her accuser, he would say no, maybe yes. In any case, she'd go to another parish, and the parish priest there would say, I'm sorry, wait, why are you coming to my parish? Shouldn't you be going to your own parish? And Henry has sort of put bounds around her speech where she can't even explain her situation. And this is just sort of the tip of the iceberg with Henry of Ghent. He has statements about, you know, what happens if you do realize a priest is sexually abusing someone? Well, he says, you certainly shouldn't immediately move them outside the parish, because then people will get very suspicious and they will be scandalized. And so it's better to probably leave him there for a couple of years and then move him to another parish, but not as if it's a big thing or acting in emergency. In other words, you know, I think what we're trying to get at is, and what Diane Elliott is getting at in her book, The Corrupters of Boys. I'll go back to this in case people want to write it down. You know, a lot of times people think, oh, what could have gone so wrong? People must not have been living by their values, like with the sex abuse crisis. And Diane Elliott has a much more damning, harrowing view of things. She says, no, this was all by centuries of design. This is a quote from one of her lectures in 2009. What I would challenge, she says, is the underlying assumption that the series of suppressions and denials we have witnessed among the higher clergy is somehow a corruption of ecclesiastical procedure or an abuse that has crept into church governance. What I hope to demonstrate is the extent to which this pattern of evasion was shaped by centuries of law and theology. So I shall go back to this just in case people wanted to write down that title. And we can take a quick little pause here and just people had reactions or thoughts or questions that they might want to share at this point about this sort of quick, really bird's eye view of centuries of history.
You know, this whole scandal has not really shocked me that much because I do know church history pretty well. And church history has been rife from the beginning with various and sundry scandals of varying intensities. But there have been several times that the church has tried to cleanse itself of this. But churchly power has often conveyed political power and material power, and the church used that. You know, like prior to Henry VIII in England, if you were in the church, you went to a special court. You went to a church court. You didn't go to a civil court. And the church was notoriously lax. It tended to forgive murderers, much less a little sex abuse. So, I mean, it's always been that way. It's a human institution. It may be divinely ordained, but it's a human institution, and humans are inherently flawed.
Right. Yeah, Jonathan, I wonder if you're not a little similar to me in this. Like sometimes my wife, Gita, she's, why do you study all this depressing stuff?
It was actually very interesting.
It's interesting. And I think what you've expressed is it gives you a sense of comfort and stability to sort of face the challenges of your own day. Is that what you're sort of saying? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because I didn't see a great, big, huge shock. Yes, we've all been talking for the last 50 years about all church people being sacred and sanctified. But, you know, if you really know church history, you know that's just not true. There's no human institution that's sanctified. And you give church officials a lot of power, especially in a podunk little town in the middle of medieval England. Priest is the big deal. And he's got clout. So yeah, I'm not saying it's good. Of course it's bad. And of course the church should continue to constantly try to rip it out, but it's still there and it's always going to be there to some degree. I mean, constantly, I mean, the list of religious leaders that have, of all faiths, that have fallen flat on their face is huge.
Arnita, did you want to jump in? Oh yeah, go ahead.
Because it appears that as far as scandalization is concerned, they're more concerned about the outside appearance of the church than the victims of who's being hurt. I mean, these people not existing or something, you know, the victims is make sure the priests and the leadership and is not embarrassed. enough.
Was not
enough-
just embarrassed, it's scandalized. If you're going to drive people
Right,
away
I
from
meant
the
that.
church,
That was a minor word. I just used that lightly in the embarrassment of it. I
Right.
meant scandalized. I know with that and shame, and it's all wrapped up in there. But
Jennifer, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that it is the women that are being addressed here.
Right.
So, I mean, he says nothing about what could happen if men or boys were abused or, done bad by, as they say. And I also think it is very interesting that it's not even sexual abuse that is often pushed under the rug. So many other things, even to this day, because one is told, well, we really don't want the church to look bad. I mean, it's like, I think it's very interesting.
Thank you, Jennifer.
And
I
this-
joined about, go ahead. Go ahead, Edie.
This just seems to be a function of any dynamic where power's involved. I mean, you just even look at domestic situations.
Right.
Or
Yes.
Hollywood.
Yes, or Hollywood. Yeah, and I think
Or business or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
it's
Edie,
hit
really,
all the churches. I mean,
Yes.
all the churches suffer from it. It's not unique to any church.
Right.
And to just pick up, I want to just really highlight what Edie said, because I think a lot of Christian history, we're going to hear things talked about in terms of desire, like, oh, people didn't have their desires under control. But Edie's really pointed us to the fact that abuse is often, I mean, it is always about power. That's what's at issue. It's not about desire. It's about the power and having power over people. That's just as big, and that we sometimes get distracted with the desire part. Alan, did you want to chime in?
I was going to say, I only got this thing to work at about 6:33. I saw the the Bible references, but I am curious, in 1200 years or 1300 years up to 1900 years, were there contrary arguments that have been passed down? I mean, it seemed this is the way it was. Well, it's the way it turned out. But were there any contrary trends or extended debate anywhere?
Yeah, that'd be a really fascinating issue to track down.
Well,
and I'll have to do that.
one of
Yeah.
the original reasons for the Protestant Reformation was to protest the abuses of the church, and that was all covering all abuses, because there were tons of them.
Yeah.
So there have been efforts.
Right. Yeah. You think of John Huss and his frustration that some of the brothels in his town had separate entrances just for the priests. And so we're going to, and yes, and of course on the reform side, Zwingli got himself in a lot of trouble as well for sleeping with the parishioner right when he came to town, and everyone excused it because, oh, the poor guy got seduced, and they blamed it on the woman. So this is just, yeah. And just to point to Jonathan's sense of things, like Christian history is real history. Jesus said, the church is my body, and the body of Christ is a wounded body. It is a way of the cross that one is studying. And so, and to Alan's question, yes, the rest of the presentation, we're going to focus in on much later, but a Victorian Anglo-Catholic who sort of offered an alternative view. But just real quick, was there any final comment from someone who hasn't spoken? I can't see you all on the screen at the same time. If anyone wanted to chime in, go ahead. Okay. And so as we sort of summarize this bit of our journey, we can say that this culture of silence is brought about by a few things. First, it subordinates the dignity of women and children to an effort to cover up scandal at any cost. It refuses to allow frank discussion about sexuality, preferring taboo and silence. And of course, those spaces of secrecy are where all sorts of abusive behavior festers. It also underestimates how traumatic sexual abuse and exploitation is. I mean, the casualness with which Henry sort of just instructs, oh, just go to the confessor and ask for his permission to leave. And then it also fails to recognize that sexual abuse is widespread. And this isn't just like the medieval period. This is any system, any culture, Hollywood. So with our next section, we're going to go to breaking the silence. And this is these are called the 4 pillars of child sex abuse awareness. And a man named Monsignor Stephen Rossetti came up with this list. He's a person who trains Roman Catholics to become the case people in the church to deal with sexual abuse and to advocate for victims. He helped with the Dallas Charter, which is one of the ways that the Catholic Church tried to reform itself in the last 20 years. So he says before a church culture can change, a few things have to happen. And it's almost the reverse of that culture of silence. One, a recognition that children and women have rights that deserve protection. 2, open, frank discussion about sexuality. He would say actually the Cultural Revolution of the 60s was really important for preparing this ground for us to deal with the sexual abuse crisis, because people actually began to talk about sexuality. He'd also say that it's important for people to recognize that sexual abuse is traumatizing. If you go look at the child psychology manuals of the 50s, people like Kinsey would say, oh, well, it happens sometimes to some children and they bounce right back. I mean, that was the casualness with which it was treated, even in the 1950s. And then last, a recognition that sexual abuse is widespread. This is not a rare thing we're dealing with. And I would argue that J. Ellice Hopkins and these religious feminists and just straight up feminists that we see working in the late 1800s, I think sort of started to build those pillars up. So a few things about our patron of the evening. This is for Jennifer. I finally have those dates for you. She was born in 1836 and she died in 1904. The last 5 years of her life, she was basically an invalid. She had so expended her body preaching up and down all over England and going on these lecture tours and trying to convince people to reform society that she had some sort of physical breakdown in 1899. And she indeed wrote some spiritual devotional material on being an invalid, on being sick. She had a very comfortable Cambridge upbringing. She's very well educated. Her mother was an accomplished musician, and her father, while not a fellow at Cambridge, was a tutor around the area, and apparently was a tutor to some very famous mathematicians and geologists. So you can sort of see she has everything we Anglo-Catholics love. She has music, she has culture, she has knowledge. And you can see probably from her father, she gets this sense of an embrace of Darwinian theory. And in this sense, she's very, I almost want to put her in with those liberal Catholics that you see gathered around Charles Gore. Apparently J. Ellice Hopkins was good friends with H.S. Holland, who contributed to Gore's, pro-Darwinian Lux Mundi collection. So there's maybe something there to do in the research to connect her more fully to that movement. But Darwinianism in the period isn't just about explaining how life forms get to their present form. There's this belief that it explains a deep structure of existence. And so she appeals to Darwinian theory to say, you know, that the most evolved form of the human male is the male who is concerned for the sexual safety of other people. Her language is chastity, right? And this is both a way to appeal to a very broad culture to say, well, this is just science that we should be taking care of other people. But it also expresses something of this background she comes from. And then again, you know, Anglo-Catholic, and one of the things we sort of see is this, you know, she calls herself a spinster, but this belief that her celibacy enabled her to pursue her work as a social and religious reformer. She, of course, is part of this much bigger movement that's happening in the late 1800s. It really comes about in fierce reaction to these laws called the Contagious Diseases Acts. And they were quite wild. They were designed for port cities and garrison towns where there were lots of soldiers. And the idea was we're going to save these soldiers from venereal disease. But what the law did was it said any plainclothes police officer, so just wearing his civvies, could go walking around these towns and randomly stop any woman he suspected of being a prostitute and demand that she submit to fortnightly gynecological exams. It was incredibly invasive. And if she refused to do those exams, she had to go to court to prove that she was a woman of good standing. Of course, this didn't do anything to stop the spread of venereal disease in these towns because they weren't examining the men, which you can't contact trace half the population and then expect it to, it doesn't work that way. And so a group of women, some of them very religious, some of them not religious at all, really began to organize tract writing and public demonstrations. I've included some pictures of a demonstration, a little sketching, and then you can, you know, this was sort of the Twitter of the day, to print up a sign and say, our legislators are scared to meet with us women. Can you imagine how cowardly they are? Sort of do a pressure campaign. It was really important in that period to remember that prostitution was a child sex abuse problem. At the time, 13 was the age of consent. And so, as Hopkins was to write in a tract of 1879, if a little bird-witted child of 13 consents to be ruined for life, the law throws on that moral baby the responsibility, and the man who has betrayed a child escapes scot-free. There was just this sense that, well, of course, we're examining the women. If we examine the men, it would lead to their demoralization. They're soldiers, and well, the women, they're prostitutes. The children, they're prostitutes. They're bereft of self-respect in the first place. That's actual language that's used. And so these protests gave women, I mean, here were respectable middle-class women publicly discussing venereal disease. And again, it's that sort of taboo-breaking power that leads to a much wider examination of the role of women and of children in society. And it gave the women the experience of thinking and speaking about previously taboo topics. And indeed, concluding that, trying to advocate that women and children have civil rights that are just as important as men's civil rights. So that's, you know, you can see that pillar being constructed. And you saw in that quote, Hopkins saying, this is a life-ruining thing that we are doing to children. Again, it's a serious matter. This isn't some, oh, they'll bounce back. So you really have to take this in and take Hopkins in with this big Victorian culture of abuse. The historian Sheila Jeffries recalls that a judge gave out a light sentence in the case of sexual assault on a 7-year-old girl, she was 7, by a middle-aged man. The judge claiming that it was common for children to seduce adult men. Quote, the sort of thing that might happen to any man end quote, the judge said. Hopkins, of course, was successful in raising the age of consent to 16. But even then, men were protected by a reasonable cause to believe clause, so that they were not responsible if they broke that consent age, just so long as it said, and there are court records like this, oh, well, even though she's my stepdaughter, I thought she was 16. I didn't know she was 14. And that lets them get out of the problem. There's also a time limit clause. They had an incredibly narrow statute of limitations. They had, if you suffered some sort of sexual assault, you had to pursue the case within 3 months of it occurring. We know that in our culture, even, people take decades to come to a place where they can speak of what happened to them. And some of our statute of limitation laws are seen as very narrow. And so you can imagine victims have 3 months to come forward. But even within this incredibly narrow statute of limitations, bringing a claim forward could be devastating for the woman or the girl. Even through the 1930s, girls under 16 were considered primarily responsible for their own assault. And while their abuser might be acquitted, they themselves would be sentenced as victims to 3 years detention in a home. So they weren't treated as if they had rights that needed protection. They were just seen as infecting society. They needed to be sequestered. And in fact, we have a quote from the Bishop of Ely, Frederick Henry Chase, who spoke at a conference on child assault. And he said that child victims of sex abuse were, quote, moral lepers, end quote, that had to be completely isolated from other children. And abused children were often put in detention homes alongside children who had committed crimes like theft. So the church, no surprise to Jonathan, not on the moral vanguard of this issue. There was a society called the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and they took to publishing lists of clergy who were guilty of such acts. They wanted to convince society that this was not just a low-class problem. This was not just the poor people have some problems. No, this is every rung of society, including the clergy. But the church would push back. For instance, there was a church organist who was accused of sexual abuse. And the cathedral canon said to this Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, well, if you keep accusing my organist, we're just going to stop doing a special Sunday collection for you. So there was just this pushback. So in almost every way imaginable, British culture justified exploitative male sexuality while punishing and isolating victims. And this is where Hopkins wrote this plea. And this is just an example of the sort of speaking that she did in her time. It's called a plea for the wider action of the Church of England in the prevention of the degradation of women. And it's only a 30-page tract, so it's very accessible to read. It was published in 1879. And, she got interested in this issue, especially when she moved to Brighton in 1866. And she began doing rescue work among women who were working as prostitutes. And she really tried to convince people in this plea that this was a widespread issue. She said she estimated there were 20,000 to 80,000 outcast women and girls in London at the time. And she argued that the church's response was insufficient. What they did was they set up penitentiaries, which was, you can tell from the name, what sort of place it was. I mean, this was for fallen women after the fact. And she said that this was a palliative and not a cure. She said even the palliative was not really being administered properly. Only 16 of the 32 dioceses in the Church of England had penitentiaries connected with the Church Penitentiary Association. And far worse, she thought, was that these penitentiaries just got everyone used to the idea that we just have an existence of this outcast class, they'll always be there. This is just what happens in a civilized country where marriage is delayed, and perhaps Mother Orange would want to weigh in on this because Felicia Steen was also interested in this problem. But, we'll send our boys off to Oxford, boys will be boys, and the church sort of just tidies up at the end of things and tries to, house a few of the women whose lives have been ruined. So Hopkins says the church indirectly ministers to the evil cause by this sort of inaction. She advocated measures to combat the root of the problem, and she specifically wanted to see men recognize how much agency they had to destroy the lives of other people. Some of her other suggestions, so that first one that I just said, no double standards for sexual purity. Men were responsible for the degradation of women and children. We've talked about raising the age of consent from 13 to 16. She also wanted to break taboos with physiological guides to sex. You've heard of the birds and the bees, and people debate about where that phrase came from. But again, her Darwinian interests led her to write these manuals that, parents could use with their children. And you'd start really young and you'd say, oh, well, this is how flowers come to be, and this is how birds come to be, this is how little baby birds come to be, and just sort of work them up progressively until you could actually talk about their own bodies. And this was very important for her because this was about empowering people through knowledge. And maybe one of the faults of lots of Victorian reformers is they have a trust in education. Sometimes we might say they ignore systemic problems. They just have a great trust if we just educate people enough. Nevertheless, there was this idea that, we just need to keep people ignorant and we'll never tell anyone about their bodies, and especially women should never be told as they're growing up, just keep them sort of in this walled garden was an image that was used. And she said, no, this is not the Christian way. She said that it's actually very important that the purity of Christ was not the purity of ignorance that leaves others to perish, but the purity of knowledge that knows in order to save. So this sense that by giving people knowledge, we're actually turning them into Christ-like beings. This is the sort of power we're giving to them. And then this touches on it because it really was a theological re-envisioning of how the church could approach sexuality. And I have a rather long passage that I want to share with you because it really does, it's just sort of her quintessential vision for things. She says, we have got rid but too surely of all that is high and noble in asceticism. But it seems to me that we have still to make a vigorous effort to shake ourselves loose from what I should call the dregs of asceticism. So she's saying, we did away with all the great stuff about asceticism and we just have the bad stuff of it now. The sense that our bodies are more or less the seat of evil, that there is something low and shameful about some of their highest functions, which leads the British parent to make a conscience of ignoring the whole subject and to send his boy to a public school without the most ordinary knowledge of the laws of his own body or its relation to the world he lives in, and to leave the most powerful elements for moral weal or woe in our nature to the guidance of chance or impure gossip. So again, the powerful elements, our bodies, that's our bodies are how we become moral. And then to go on, the Christian church has yet got frankly to receive the teaching of modern sciences, that this matter, which we have been accustomed to call brute and gross and dead, is a ceaseless activity, a glory and a wonder only second to the reasonable soul itself. To recognize the material part of us as a far more vital factor in the divine life than she at present does. To teach with far more emphasis that the body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, and train us in that habitual reverence for our body, which would make us recognize its functions as sacramental, the visible sign and token of the high purpose and meaning, from which they are not to be divorced without our incurring for ourselves and for others sundry kinds of death. So again, this wonderful sense, and it feels like a passage that could have come from Lux Mundi, that we have not tapped into the sacramental potential of our lives, and that by ignoring our bodies, we are ignoring a fount of holiness, and that these are not things to be ashamed of, not things to be hidden. I just think that that's at least me in my ignorance of historical things, I was surprised to find a Victorian wrote something like this.
This could be twisted really, really easily.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Go ahead.
I mean, you're going
And
to
then
say,
Jennifer.
okay, the functions of your body are sacramental.
Mhm.
That could be twisted.
Yeah. Jennifer, did you have a similar concern?
Yes, no, well, it's like all very well to try to educate people about how they should treat their body as a temple. But what do you do when the master of the house or your
Right.
boss takes advantage of you, and then the girl gets pregnant, and then
Right.
she's thrown out of the house, and she has no recourse but to become a prostitute? I mean,
Right.
I frankly think that this young lady is barking up the wrong tree. It
Right.
doesn't matter how you feel about your body. If you
Mhm.
are forced into a sexual act, and there's nothing you can do.
Yes.
And in
Yes.
Victorian times particularly, this sort
Yes.
of behavior was prone. The poorhouses and the penitentiaries were filled with people, girls and boys, who had been abused and had no home.
Right. And I think there's a very strong sense in the feminist historical scholarship that this was in some ways too little, too late, and that that they were still putting the agency as if they had it on the women. And
Not only women, it was
it's not
young
yes.
children, boys and
Yes.
girls.
Mhm.
The poor,
Exactly.
the butler's child, the guy who the little boy who cleans shoes. I mean,
Right. I think you're
not
you're
just a
touching.
female problem at all.
Yeah, you're touching on this issue that even while there are these taboos being broken, I think that there's still I think we're sensing that there's a taboo in these texts about speaking about male children being sexually abused. That's a taboo that isn't broken, and that it's not just about women, it's about children, like you said. Yeah.
There was also a large population of male prostitutes in London that were not
Right.
children.
Right.
But they were
and she does not
prostitutes
talk
for the
about
same
them.
reason the women were.
Right.
It applies to every class and every sex.
Yes. Yeah. And I think
And this was a brutal time.
Yeah.
This was early industrialization. It was, get your money any way you can. And if you have to starve and kill a few people, okay, so that's in the name of progress. And that was the overall attitude.
Right. Yes. And I think that there's a disappointment among feminist historians that this was just going to play into male structures of power, that this was about women controlling women and doing the duty of the master. Yeah, it sounds like you have more thoughts, Jennifer.
Yeah, I think that's too narrow.
Too narrow.
I mean, it's not just women who are abused by men.
Mhm.
Women are abused by other women. It's people
Right.
who are abused. It's not just a feminine problem. And I think
Right.
people get their knickers in a twist and go, well, I as a woman need to stand up and not take this abuse. But what about that child, that boy child? It's a universal problem.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry, but I feel obviously very strongly about it.
Oh, yes. And
I'm a
you
woman.
should.
Not
Yes.
just,
Yes. Right. And yeah, it's ambiguous, like as some do we want to, you can't lift J. Ellice Hopkins up as a model that we can use now. But what does one, how does one read what she did do? Yeah, it's a big
But
question.
I think it's confusing. Why did she move to Brighton? The nice sea air, really great place to live.
It was also a great vacation spot that a lot of hookers
Exactly.
went to.
Maybe that was it. I don't know. Are there other thoughts or other questions? Yes, go ahead, Mother Orns.
Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. No, I feel a little differently. I understand the comments made, but I'm very impressed by Ellice Hopkins because no one was speaking out as she was. She was one of the first.
True.
And I admire what she had to say. This was a pamphlet that said, a plea for the wider action of the Church of England. Of course, it's an early voice, but it's a voice to be heard and a voice to be savored. And when it comes to spirituality, first thing you have to do is recognize your own body is a temple. That's a positive statement, which leads to action. And she was someone who spoke up for action. So I admire her for what she had to say. This is early times. We don't have real strong feminist 21st century women speaking here. We have people who are speaking up for the first time. Hallelujah. I admire her.
Well, and I also wonder, sometimes the movement that she sort of folded into is called the social purity movement. And in some ways, that movement is far more advanced in matters of justice than the purity movements that are in a lot of our churches today. It's more common in evangelical or mega churches or conservative Catholic churches, but this sense that that what purity is a guarding the self from sin, and at all costs guarding oneself. And for Hopkins, it really is more about, it's directed towards the other person, and it's about preserving the dignity of another person. And that's another contrast that I sort of strike with some of the voices of our own time. Other thoughts or questions or reactions?
One of the early popes, I think it was one of the Medici ones, and I've forgotten which one it was, but when he was elected, he proclaimed, "God has given us the papacy, now let us enjoy it." Now, that is the attitude of many people who achieve power. And church is a way to achieve power. So it's going to attract a certain type of people. And I'm not saying everybody, I'm just saying there will be certain types who will go to it because they recognize the attractions it can give.
Right.
So the church must be ever vigilant on looking for this sort of thing, but we're never going to stamp it out. We can certainly cut it back, hopefully.
Right. And I feel like we've sort of touched on some of the things that will make a church culture more protective or more, I don't quite know, more vigilant. I don't know what we want to say. But I think Jennifer's deep sense that this is an issue that can affect anyone, that do not have some cliche victim in your head. This could happen to anyone, and it's pervasive. And then Edie's sense that this is really about power and people controlling one another, and how do we make a community life where that's not the language we're trying to speak to each other. It's not about control or charisma. It's something else that has to be at the center of our life together.
Openness is the tool. It is through openness that this stuff is always found. So a church should strive to be as open and transparent as it can. I know that's a very misused term. We used to use it at work all the time. I hated it. But anyway, still, transparency is essential.
Mhm.
You know, one thing that might have gone unnoticed is that when these training sessions began in the diocese, one of the results from this awareness was that now you can't have a closed door in a church building. You have to have a window in it. If you'll notice, I mean, we had to put windows in all the doors
Yeah.
and walls, and
Yes.
it's you know, tricky because they're, you know,
It also
sometimes-
works both ways. You
yeah,
know, you're if you're in there, say, with a bunch of children for kindergarten or whatever, it helps protect you too.
yes.
Gregory,
Yeah,
I
but
noticed
there are
that
times-
sorry.
There are times when, you know, for instance, if you're going for confession or something, you might rather not have somebody know you're there or see that you're crying or whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But
Gregory, I saw that you turned on your camera. Did you have a question that you wanted to, or a comment?
Yeah, first off, apologies for being late. I think it's fascinating to hear, you know, in the undergraduate classes I've had with some kind of this feminist theory and kind of some of the issues we were talking about. I think it's interesting to claim it in a Christian space and using that as kind of a window to look at these issues, because I had not been exposed to this type of presentation before, and I think it's very, very interesting, and is a good part of our witness as a church, and kind of the things we've done and things we should be doing. So I applaud you, and I thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you, Gregory. Yeah, and I would recommend the work of Sheila Jeffries to you. The book title is The Spinster and Her Enemies, Feminism and Sexuality, 1880 to 1930, because Sheila Jeffries is not, I don't think, identifies in any way as a religious person, and yet is one of the historians who said, actually, I don't really care if Hopkins believes in God or not. She did really radical things for her time and helped push a conversation in a direction that I like, so I'm going to lift her up anyways. And it's sort of, in some ways, this is why there's such an understudied area of Hopkins' life, because the ecclesiastical historians sadly often aren't interested in questions of gender. And you know, when you think of how we are taught the Oxford movement, it's a bunch of guys we learn about. And then the feminist historians often are not interested in religion in the same way. And so it leaves these gaps that we can hopefully begin to fill in.
I was interested in the, you had a quote where she said something along the lines of, kind of, we've gotten rid of all the good stuff about aestheticism, but then kept all the bad stuff. And the bad stuff is like how we think our bodies are terrible and gross. Which kind of surprised me, because my understanding of aestheticism was that like aestheticism was really kind of, I don't know, into it, like the fleshly poets, the poets that talked a lot about like our bodies and our experiences and things like that. So yeah, I was interested to hear about the positioning of these new conversations about sex within the context of the Oxford movement and the kind of Anglo-Catholicism and aestheticism. There's not really a question.
Right. Well, no, it is very interesting though, because like you do see Pusey and others like him calling for more asceticism and more fasting and things like this, but it's a notion of ascetical effort that is, I mean, it's a little privatized. It's a little bit about, and maybe Dr. Orange would shed more light on this, but it's sort of private. And this is an interest in asceticism that is looking outward and towards the other and towards refashioning how society works. So yeah, thank you, Durango, for that. And we are at time, but if there's anyone who hasn't spoken, who was wanting to get in the last word, we can make some space for that person.
It's been I think it's been a wonderful presentation. And I applaud you for bringing all of this to our attention. So thank you enormously.
Thank you, Mother Orenson, and thank you everyone for bringing so much of yourselves to this conversation. It's really a pleasure. I mean, I'll tell you all this. Actually, the first time I came to a service here, it was a Wednesday night, and the depth of all of your conversation and your willingness to engage difficult topics, and your sensitivity and your kindness and your intelligence, that was all something that made me say, I think I want to be at St. Paul's next year. So, yeah. And thank
Glad to
you,
hear.
Elijah, for doing all the camera work.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.